He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today we have a very special episode. Before we get to that, however, a couple of quick plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca. You can send us an email, cryptidclues@gmail.com, or check us out on our social media channels, Patreon, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, all that. But let's welcome Derek to the show. Happy to have you here, Derek. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay. You ready to rock and roll?
Ready to rock and roll.
All right. All right. This story comes from 1981. It's up at a isolated cabin in the wilderness in southern Oregon. It's between Medford and Klamath Falls, up in the national parks there. My wife's family settled southern Oregon, and they had a lot of land that they owned up in the mountains there for grazing cattle and for the summer. And so my wife's father and her grandfather built this cabin in 1945. And ever since, we all just go up there every year. Of course, I didn't come into the family until 1977. But every year, we've been going up there. Each of us has a week or two, and then we'll go up for building projects and stuff like that for the family and so forth. And this was, we always took the late shift. They would close the cabin up at Labor Day, but not totally. We would come in after Labor Day. They'd have all the fences put back up and so forth. And we'd take it for a couple of weeks after Labor Day. The weather would be turning. It would be a little colder, and it wasn't popular with the rest of the family, but we didn't mind. And so what we did was, before we had the drought situations we're dealing with now, back in 81, we didn't have a drought problem. And so we were able to have an open campfire out by the cabin, which was located, 25 yards from the cabin itself. And every evening we'd have a fire going and just sit around. There's beautiful rocks to sit on, or the camp chairs. And that evening, it was myself and my wife and my sister-in-law, who was 16 at the time, and our 18-month-old oldest child. She was asleep up in the cabin on the bed. It was about 10 o'clock at night. And we were sitting around cooking s'mores, and just having a good old time. Now, when I tell this story, I like to emphasize to people there was no alcohol involved, for I had run out of beer 3 days earlier. And I wasn't going through the DTs. And so there was no outer influences on the workings of my mind. We were sitting around, and when you're ever out in the wilderness, you've always heard the background noise, the crickets, the little things that you hear off in the background, coyotes or whatever, or birds. And I noticed it was deathly silent. There was no noise. And I commented on it to my wife. I said, "Ange, there's no outside noise. What's going on?" And just when I said that, from the opposite side of the campfire, maybe 100 yards away, was the corner of the pasture. This scream came out. Now, I've spent all my life outdoors, and I've spent, weeks out in the wilderness just living rough. It was fun, but I've never heard that. I've heard mountain lions, I've heard bears, I've heard eagles, I've heard owls, I've heard everything that we have normally around here. And I never heard this kind of a scream. It was a mix between a mountain lion cat scream and a woman scream. But the one thing I noticed on it was super powerful. Even though it was 100 yards away, you could hear it as clear as a bell. And I looked at Angie and I said, "What in the world was that?" And then from over towards where the cabin is, there's a trail that goes down to the outhouse. That's about 30 yards down to the outhouse. And there's a trail that goes off along that area where the scream was. We heard coming from over by the outhouse another scream that answered it. And so it screamed back. And then we heard coming through the thick trees, boom, boom, boom. It was not padump, padump, padump of a deer. It was a something walking step by step. It was heavy. It was big. And it came down. And now it was pitch black out, of course, except around the fire. So we could only locate it by sound. And this thing was coming pretty close. It was maybe 30 feet from us. And it was in the meadow, clearly out of the woods by then. But again, we still could not see it per se. I had a rifle. We always have a rifle up there for the bears and the mountain lions and all the things that come visiting at night. And so I thought I shot 3 shots in the air. I didn't want to shoot it. I'm not the kind of guy that shoots at noises. Whatever it was big. I had a 22. I really didn't want to hit it. That would only irritate it. And so I shot above it into the air 3 times. And I told the girls, get to the cabin. So they run off to the cabin. And I get up and I put the fire out because you can't leave a fire running, and have a lantern. And I walk back up to the cabin. I come up to the door and they'd locked me out. And so I couldn't get in. I'm knocking. They're afraid to open the door. Finally, they let me in. And we're sitting in the cabin now, wondering what to do. My wife looked at me and she says, I've never seen you look like this. You know, I've always been confident. And I was, yeah, I don't know what that is. And so we decided that we're just going to grab the baby. We're going to go out the back door where the car's parked out by there's a couple of outbuildings there. And I said, we're going to go out into the drive, the back drive. And I'm going to take the lantern. It was a gas lantern, a Coleman. And I'm going to put it on the ground. I want you girls to run and get in the car. I'm going to turn the lamp off, and it takes a little while for that gas lamp to die. And I had time to get to the car. And of course, I had the rifle with me. So we did that. And I got in the car safely. The light died out. I started the car, put it in reverse, backed up into the meadow next to the cabin, put it in drive, and the car wouldn't move. And right then, my spidey senses are going, oh, crap, you know, something's wrong here. Then I realized I had the parking brake on because you do stupid things when you're panicking. So I flipped the parking brake and we drove off. We had to go about, quarter of a mile to get to the first gate. This is a dirt road that's 2 miles from the paved highway. Not a highway, just an old 2-lane road. And you have to go through 3 locked gates because of the cattle. You can't have them roaming around. So you have to get out and unlock the gate, open the gate, drive the car through, go back, close the gate, lock the gate. And you had to do this 3 times. And going out is not bad. You got the headlights. Coming back, it's just the tail lights. And it was quite nerve-wracking. So we safely got through that, went down, hit the highway, drove down to the farm where the family was all down in Medford area in Talent. And when we got in there, it was about midnight. And of course, the car's pulling into the farm. That wakes up Uncle David. And he comes up and he says, what's going on? So I told him. First thing he asked was, you been drinking? And I said, no, I ran out of beer. And he's one of those that's been up at that cabin since its inception. He was a little kid, but he'd always been up there. And he says, nobody's ever had something like that happen. And the reason that he took it at face value was because my wife was there and my niece was there. And so it wasn't just crazy old Derek and his fancy storytelling fun times. And so the next morning, a bunch of cousins got together from in the area. And so we caravanned up in 2 or 3 cars, and we were loaded for bear. Uncle David had a .457 Magnum sitting on the front seat of my truck when I went back up there. So we all piled back up there. We got there mid-morning, say around 10 o'clock in the morning, and nothing seemed disturbed. But we walked down to the campfire area. And in the ashes and in the sand all around, or the dirt all around the campfire, were 3 different sets of footprints. There was a small one at 14.5 inches, a medium one at 15.5 inches, and then a big one at 17 inches. I went to the area where the creature had approached, and on the opposite side of a log, there was a perfect imprint that went down about 3/4 of an inch into the soil. Now, it was on the grass, but it was a perfect outline. You can see the outline of the foot with it. my wife ran her fingers around the outline of each foot, and it looked like a foot with the exception of the big toe. That projected off a little bit out more than ours. I was 175 pounds at the time. I was wearing cowboy boots. I stood on that log and I jumped down next to it and I went into the ground a 1/4 inch. And so whatever this was very, very heavy. I tracked it back up to the path that went to the outhouse and saw where this was the small one, 14.5 inch that came down to investigate. The big one was up at the trail. We followed his path up towards the cabin and we have pictures of the tape measures of the footprints and all that stuff. I didn't think to take plaster or Paris to make a cast. But we've got pictures with tapes, measuring tapes inside the footprints. The stride on the big boy, the 17-incher, from the tip of his right foot to the heel of his left toe was 6 feet. That's how long of a step. My stride's 3 foot. And this thing had a massive step on it. I followed that one up, and I almost wish I hadn't, because it went up right next to the cabin. And at the corner where this thing was standing, both feet, you can see him pointing right at the cabin. It was standing next to the wall. There's a window about 7 feet high from the kitchen. It was watching through the window as we were in the cabin, and most likely was there when we came out 3 feet away out that side door. We went and traced the rest of the footprints back to where the first scream came from. And so we've got massive amounts of footprints. All the cousins saw it. They were all amazed. They'd never had an encounter like this. When we cleaned up the cabin and we went back down to the farm, I called a friend of mine. I lived in Idaho at the time. His name was Bruce. And the year before, he was up at Mount St. Helens in Oregon or Washington. And that was just the year it blew. And he's a spelunker, a little skinny guy. And he would go down into these lava tubes and go exploring. And he was telling me when he came back from his trip how he'd been down this one lava tube. And as he was in this dark area and maneuvering between rocks, he felt a fresh breeze on his face. And he looked and he saw a little light way up. It was a vent. And so he crawled up that vent. And he crawled up and he says it popped up in this little small clearing, maybe 30 feet round. He popped his head up and immediately the hair on his neck went up. Sensing something's here. And that's when a scream came from one side of the little meadow right off in the trees to the other side, and it was screamed back. There was 2 of them screaming. And he popped back down the hole and took off. So I asked him, I said, Bruce, could you imitate the scream? And he did. And it was exactly what we had heard. So his confirmation was there. Then back in Idaho, one of the elders in the church, he had me out to his farm to work, maybe 6 months after my experience. And he says, J.D. Shaw was his name. Still alive, actually. He's about 905. But he had me out doing some electrical work at one of his barns. And as I was packing up my stuff, he's leaning against the truck and we were talking. And he says, that story you tell? I said, yeah. He said, I was up in the Sawtooth. This was like 20 years ago. And that's just the hills outside of southern Oregon, between Oregon and Nevada. He was deer hunting. It was the opening day of deer season. He was alone. He'd horsebacked up into the real remote sections. And he said he'd come out, and here was this little meadow with a stream in the middle. And he was at the upwind side of it, at the edge of the forest, and he saw a bear. And he thought, well, that's neat. So he sat back to watch the bear. And he said, this bear, all of a sudden, this big head picked up and turned around and looked at him. And it had a face. It wasn't a bear. And this thing stood up. And he said it was over 7 feet tall. It looked at him. It was covered with a brown fur. Looked at him, turned around, and walked off into the woods. And he didn't shoot it or nothing. He just sat and watched the thing. And the thing was, he had that experience, but back in those days, and sometimes in our modern era, you tell a story like that, people think you're nuts, And so he was, he's an elder in the congregation. He had to keep his reputation up. And so he told me, he says, Derek, he says, I believe you. He says, because I've had the experience. He says, but if you tell anybody, I'm going to call you a liar to your face. And I said, okay, JD, I won't tell nobody. Well, he's so old now. And if he listens to this blog, he'll have to forgive me, or to this interview. Then we can go a little bit forward. My daughter grew up, got married to this wonderful guy, my son-in-law, and they started coming up to the cabin with us. Now, it was their first year of marriage, about 25 years ago, and they brought their own tent. And being newlyweds, they didn't want to be near the family cabin where everybody was. They wanted some privacy. They went off onto the meadow that was up closer to the gate, found a spot, made themselves their tent and stuff. And we were having a great time. They went to bed that night. And now they're behind a big grove of trees, so I couldn't hear much coming from their area. Of course, it's nighttime and I was asleep. But he said he woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning and just had this feeling, something, he didn't know what. And he's laying in the tent and he's just listening, and he hears, and all of a sudden the scream came from outside of the tent, and it was answered from about 100, 200 yards away on the other direction. It freaked him out. He had always mocked me about this situation. He had a pistol, and his dad had given him, so he didn't know what to do. He didn't want to shoot towards the noise. So he shot a hole in the top of his brand new tent and to tell it to go away. And so I didn't hear the shot. But when I got up about 5:30, 6 o'clock the next morning to make coffee, light the wood fire, beautiful cabin, it's all heated by a wood stove. And I was cooking some coffee. I see him sitting down at the fire pit. And so I made him a cup of coffee and went on down there and I handed it to him. And he just looked at me and said, "I believe." And he told me what happened. And we've heard vocalizations of them up in that area, even up into the last couple of years. We've heard them. They do tree thumping, where they'll take a stick and they'll whop on the tree. Then they have several vocalizations. One of them is that scream, which actually I went looking, and there's a site called bfro.org. And I went there and they had vocalizations, and we found one from Oklahoma, I believe it was, where someone recorded this scream, and it's the exact. My wife was there and just chills went up her back. And so I have those recordings. When I tell this story, I play the scream for them so that they can hear what we heard. We've had a few friends we had one friend that actually lived up the same area on the same road where the cabin is. They had an experience of driving. This lady and her girlfriend, they were driving up the road late at night, heading to Lake of the Woods. And they came around a corner, and this big one, it was red-haired, was standing next to the road. And they just drove right on by it. And they drove in silence for a few minutes. And then one of them said, did you see what I saw? And the other one said, yeah. And so when they heard us with our experience, he said, oh yeah, no, I've seen one. It was standing on the road. And this was just a couple of miles from where the cabin's located. Our theory is that the reason we haven't heard of them, the family hadn't heard much of them, there was a big contingency in all the research I've done on Bigfoot. There was a big bunch of sightings around Mount St. Helens. And so the theory that I think of was because of the eruptions and everything that happened there, they all relocated. And they were probably passing through. It's amazing how many sightings there are and in almost every state except Hawaii that I know of. We had a sighting just about 4 weeks ago. Now it wasn't me. It was my daughter, the one who was asleep when she was a baby. Her and some of her friends were staying up at a timeshare up at Tahoe for the weekend, just to hang out and have girl time. And there was 4 of them, and they were in the car and they were driving down what's called Highway 50. And Highway 50 is a small 2-lane highway from Pollock Pines up to Tahoe. It's about a 40-mile trip from that area, and then it's 4 lanes after that. But they were on the 2-lane section. It's really windy, and it's dark. The sun, it's wintertime still here, so the sun goes down 4:45, 5 o'clock. Now it's still there, but it's gone. It's twilight now. So it was about 6, 7 o'clock. They were coming in because they all had to go to work the next day. And they were driving, 4 of them in the car. My daughter was in the back seat. And they come around this hairpin corner. Of course, they got the brights on because there's not much travel on that road on a Sunday night. They come around the corner, and right in front of him, stepping out of the woods, was this tall, brown, reddish, black, depending on which one you talk to, long-haired creature on the hind legs. They all estimated, I talked to one of the girls yesterday, and she thought it was over 8 feet. But my daughter and the others were saying 7.5 to 8 feet tall. And it stepped out onto the highway right in front of the car, just like a pedestrian would do without looking, you know. It stepped out. When the car came around the corner, it jerked back into the woods to get out of the way. And she says it's just like if you stepped out yourself, saw danger, and jumped back. And that's what it did. They locked up the brakes, spun around it. They didn't hit it. My first question to them was, did you have a dash cam? And they didn't. And so she was, Michelle was in favor of going back. She said, let's go back. And the others were not in favor of that. And so she got outvoted and they came down. My daughter immediately notified me by text. It was exciting. And this was at probably 40 miles from my house. And I live in Fair Oaks outside of Sacramento. It's outside of a little tiny town called Kybers, and it's super thick forest through there. And so there's been sightings there. There's been sightings at Tahoe. There's been sightings. We have a small town out here called Georgetown, and there's been sightings at Georgetown. Have there been hoaxes? Yes. There's been, rednecks up there with their stupid cutouts and such, but they're usually proved pretty quick. But in the research that I did, and I always watch, now I have an alert for any Bigfoot thing that comes on the news on the internet, and it'll pop it up and I'll see where it was and if it sounds real or if it's just somebody who was drinking too much. Do I believe in Bigfoot? Absolutely. Because of the experience we had. My wife, absolutely. My children, most of them. Some of them still mock because they have not had their experience. And if you stay out in the woods, are you going to have one? Well, let's see. I'm 67 years old. I've had two. One when I was a teenager, didn't know it, what it was. And once when I was, at that time, I'd have been about 26 or so. And the rest of the time I have not. Now I've heard vocalizations, and the only reason I know that is because I know what they sound like. I've heard tree knocking, and the only reason I know that is because I know what it sounds like. And so when you have that knowledge, do we still go up to the cabin? Yes, every year. I do not stay at the cabin. I stay at Lake of the Woods because I've got an RV. It's a lot more comfortable than having to go up into a cabin with no water, no electricity, and a 5-gallon bucket at the outhouses. So I chose, at my age, I like the trailer. So I hang out there, and you can still hear it. I can still hear it even out there. A lot of the locals absolutely believe in him. They say, oh yeah, there's something out there. Here's the question I get from people. Why don't we find one? Why, with all the cameras, with all the dash cams, with all the cell phones, why don't we find one? Why don't we find one that's dead? Why isn't there one killed that's roadkill? The answer that I've got for them from the research that I've done is simply this. There's a lot of bears that get hit by cars. They don't go back to look. They don't know. If you've ever seen what happens to a body of an animal in the woods, and actually I did the research, they took a roadkill deer. They took it off away into the wilderness and staked it down on the ground. Tied it down so that animals couldn't drag the body off. They put a trail camera right over the deer. This was summertime. And the trail camera took a picture every minute. And you saw that deer inflate and then go down. And then you saw all this wiggling, and that was all the maggots and the bugs and so forth doing its thing. And within 4 or 5 days, it was unrecognizable. You knew it was something that had fur. Within 6 and 7 days, there was nothing there. Because now it was down to bones, and all the animals had drugged the bones away because it tied down the body, not the bones. So that's one reason. Another one that I use with my people in my area, in our area of the Sierra Nevadas, which is Lake Tahoe and all that up nearby us, there is an annual census that they do of the deer population. And the last one I checked, it was 1,600 deer per square mile up in those counties. That's a lot of deer. If you've ever gone camping, you do see deer. But do you see 1,600? No, you see 4 or 5. And those are usually the ones that know they can be around humans and not be afraid of them. Why don't you see the rest of them? Because deer don't want to be seen. I'm a deer hunter. In Idaho, that's how we fed ourselves over the winter, was because you would go out and get a deer and you'd eat off of that for the whole winter time. And deer are not easy to find. And if they don't want to be seen, if they hold still, they are not seen. Now take an animal that's been shown to be nocturnal. Most of the sightings are at night, early morning or late evening. You find an animal that's solitary or in small family groups that lives maybe 3 or 4 per 1,000 square mile, and it doesn't want to be seen. What's the odds you're going to see this thing? You're not. And it's only by accident. And most of the accounts that I've read and researched, the Bigfoot was just as surprised as the person that found him was, because they weren't expecting to see people. If they heard people, I'm sure they'd stay away, just like deer do. There's a lot of accounts, some credible, some not. You can go on YouTube. You can find yourself an old grizzled redneck that's talking about that Bigfoot he saw. His hair was beautiful. It was long and luscious, but I had to get rid of him, so I had to rough talk him. So I said, get, and it get. Now you get an interview with that, and you're laughing. You know, you find those kind of things. Now, did the guy have an experience? Maybe, but you know, he didn't represent himself well. There's a lot of college professors, a lot of scientists that have had these encounters. These are not local rednecks that drink moonshine. These are people who are normal, everyday people with an encounter. And that's what's convincing to me. Is it a hoax? Some people try. I had one guy say, well, maybe it was just some college kids pulling a prank on you. And I said, well, here's the trick. We're 2 miles out in the middle of the wilderness away from the paved road, 8 miles from the nearest electric light. You have to go through 3 lock gates to get to where this cabin is, and you have to know where it is. Also, you see a campfire with a guy and 2 young women sitting with him at the fire, and he's got a rifle in his lap. Now, are you going to put on a monkey suit and try and scare him? You got a death wish. You know, so the odds are, no, this was something that was real. And we absolutely believe that it's real. And I've gotten quite a few people that have had these kind of experiences, and they don't want to talk about them. I don't mind talking about them because I really don't care if people think I'm crazy. I'm not. I'm a good storyteller. And do I elaborate? Maybe. But it's true. What's happened to us was true. And I've got dash cams on all my vehicles that go up into the mountains now. And so hopefully one day, yes, they'll be found. You put a drone up in the air. Well, the drones are noisy. I don't think this thing's going to stand out in the middle of the meadow and wave at it, you know? Maybe they'll have a stealth drone, maybe. Trail cams, have they found them? Yes, they have. If you search trail cam and Bigfoot pictures, you're going to find one of a juvenile Bigfoot that's standing on its hind legs, bent over at its hip, and its nose is on the ground, smelling something right in front of the trail camera. And at glance, some people say it's a bear. You could follow that arm down. It's a big, long arm. And now, how come Bigfoots are big? What are they? Well, my research, my theory is that they are an American ape, or a long-legged version of an ape. And the thing that convinced me was some research that I did. This is back in 1980, so we didn't have internet. We had a thing called the library, and we had to go down there and check out a book. And I did. And I found one article about the African ape, the silverbacks. And they had a picture of an African ape, a silverback that had been killed by some bush hunters. And they had stood the thing up against a wall, and next to it, they stood an average African guy, 5'6", right next to him. They're about the same height. Then they sat the ape down on its butt, sat the African dude down next to it, and that ape was 2 feet taller than that man. Now, if you had an ape that had legs in proportion to the body length, that creature would be 7 feet to 8 feet tall. And it would weigh in at 800 to 1,000 pounds, depending on how big it is, you know, what the breed is. A lot of the sightings, like they say the Patterson films, I've really closely watched the Patterson films, and I think it's authentic. If you look at it closely, frame by frame, you're going to see it's a female. She has breasts. And the way it's walking, it's not like a guy in a monkey suit. Now, can there be CG guys? Oh, of course. Now we're going to get deep fakes all over the place. But I believe we're going to find one. There's been accounts where they have, but through stupidity or greed, it's never been shared with the regular public. So I believe we've got us a big ape living here in the Americas, in Canada. They're sighted in Florida. They're called a swamp ape there. In Oklahoma, they're sighted quite often. In all of the northern states, the biggest concentration that I've seen in studying them up is California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, all up in those areas where it's a beautiful forest. I mean, if you've ever been out there, you know you can't see beyond far at all. And so it's an amazing thing. And I encourage everybody to go out and just keep your ears and eyes open. If you have an encounter, don't be afraid. Okay, we've never seen one get aggressive. I've seen them get curious, but not aggressive. All the accounts that I've read, there's a few accounts of them causing harm, but that is usually from someone who has caused them harm. There's one account about a bunch of hunters at the turn of the 1900s up in Washington, and they had gone up and they had a run-in. They saw some up on a cliff. One of the guys shot one, and it fell off the cliff. And it was getting dusk, and so they went back to their cabin and decided in the morning they're going to go up and find the body and bring it down and be rich. And they were in the cabin, and that night the cabin was attacked by Bigfoots, a group of them, throwing rocks and trees, screaming, yelling. The guys were cowering in fear in the cabin. And so needless to say, they were very cautious when they went out, but they did go back, and they could not find the body. Why is that? Don't know. Did they drag it off? Could have been. Maybe they weren't looking at the right spot either. So you don't know. And so the proof is out there. It's not crazy. It's not insane. I don't believe it's aliens. I don't believe it's supernatural. I believe it's an animal. And it's an animal that exists among us. And as we should with all animals, study them as much as we can. Don't kill them. Don't hurt them. You know, just study them. Don't need to capture one. We've got enough technology now. I think we could track them. But it's going to be fun. I'm semi-retired now, so I'm actually looking forward to joining some groups to go out and start tracking, you know, and having a ball. If you watch the TV shows, Finding Bigfoot and all that, you know, it's one of those, what do they call those? Situation reality TVs that are about as fake as can be. You know, when you got a guy named Bubba, this guy describing, no, you know, you need some reputable people that are educated doing it. There's a few documentaries that I've seen. There's a few books that I've read from doctors or professors. Some are very, very much convinced, and other people call them crackpots, you know, but I'm very much convinced. I'm crazy, yeah, but I'm not a crackpot. You know, I know what I saw. Mm-hmm. Can I fill anything else in for you?
Oh, that was wonderful. That was wonderful.
Okay. Good.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no problem. Love to share it, actually. It's way fun. You know,
me and my co-host, we like to look at real life examples and mannerisms from apes and other animals, and just kind of like apply that in a realistic sense to Bigfoot and look for those comparisons. And we found that there were some scientific studies showing certain apes banging sticks on tree roots, making sounds, communicating. Yeah, and it's funny because then that's something you could apply to a Bigfoot and other types of vocalizations and whatnot. It's interesting how those similarities arise.
It is, and I'm not a believer per se myself in evolution. I believe in creation, and it makes me unpopular with some people, but there is evolution in species. You know, you're going to find that in the ape world, in the monkey world, in the human world. I mean, look at the differences in humans that we have here. And so, yes, depending on where you're at, you're going to adapt to that climate. That's my explanation for the Yeti. It's simply a mountain gorilla with the long legs that fit, and it lives up in the Himalayas or up in that area. And yes, it's going to have white fur, and so there's been there's just too much evidence that I've seen from non-crackpots. There's all the idiots that say they've got one, but until we actually have some scientific proof of it, and you're not going to find them. They don't want to be found. And so it's going to be an accident. Somebody will stumble across one. I like to think of my favorite movie is Harry and the Hendersons. And if that ever does happen, boy, I hope they get the body and bring it down and get some researchers to actually look at it and don't sell it to some Geraldo Rivera guy, Let's get somebody to really look at one of these things and see what it is. And I think they're going to find that it's just a very rare ape that's been found. And again, part of my proof is you look at what's discovered nowadays. The giant squid wasn't seen until this last couple of decades. They've heard of it. They've heard Jules Verne. They've heard all that. They've seen marks on the whales, but they've never had a giant squid until that Japanese guy sent a camera down and found one. And so they're there. There's a lot of fish that people say have been extinct that are still there. And there's a lot of animals that people say are extinct that are still there. It's just that they're not going to hang around people because people kill them. And so that's why they go off and live off in the great outdoors that we got. And everybody thinks, oh, we're so populated. Well, like up in your area, go for a walk. How long does it take you to be out in the middle of nothing?
Oh, it doesn't take long.
That's right. See, same thing here. Now here I've got it perfect. I love California. I'm a Californian born and bred. There are a bunch of nutty people here, but I can sit in my backyard and I can look out to the east and I see the Sierra Nevadas. A really nice view of them. They're maybe 25, 30 miles before you start getting up into them. And I can sit on my backyard and I can see all the snow. Now, I lived in Idaho for 5 years. I prefer sitting in my backyard and looking at that snow because living in it is a little different. A lot of work and stuff. So it's perfect where I'm at. I can be, I love our location. We're 2 hours from San Francisco, the Bay Area, the coast, the Redwoods, all the cool stuff there. We're 2 hours from Lake Tahoe. We've got millions of lakes up here, campgrounds, all sorts of wildlife. We've even had mountain lion within a mile of my house in a couple of housing tracts. They come down the American River hunting the deer because the deer come down. And they found a little trick that if they can go into a isolated old time, Fair Oaks is very old. We've been around for over 100 years. So the houses are far apart. They're sort of remote. And they found that there's these wonderful little tasty items called dogs and cats. And so they'll come down and hunt those if they can't get the deer. But there was one spotted in a tree just a couple of years ago, just within a mile of my house. They put out an alert: don't let your kids out, don't let the dogs out. And they called animal control, and they hit it with a dart, took it back up in the mountains. But it happens. We get deer, we get possum, we get all sorts. I get raccoons all over the place. And so animals are adapting to us, but we're not as populous as we think we are. We just like to live all close together. You get out in the sticks and you will find stories of people who, oh yeah, my uncle ran into one, or oh yeah, I had this experience when I was a kid. And if you're really interested in it, search some of the legitimate websites. BFRO.org is one that I've been checking their stuff out for over 30 years. So they've got long-standing. They don't take. They verify every sighting. I sent my sighting into them. There's a couple of others that I have sent the account of it into. They verify. They call. They make sure you're not a nutbag. And then now in my case, I didn't know they existed back in '81, so I didn't call anybody. So you can't go back up there and find the footprints, but you can sure look at the pictures. And so I keep them and I share them with people, and I have fun because I have a big backyard here in Fair Oaks, and I have a koi pond with a waterfall and stuff. And I've got this camping fire set out here with camp chairs set around. And so on the good nights, when it's not terribly cold, we'll put a campfire out, have some people over, we'll have some chili. And they always say, Derek, I want to hear that story. And it always sounds better out by the campfire, you know? And I've had quite a few people just get really excited about it. And so they say, we want to go to your cabin. And I said, well, yeah, eventually we'll get you up there. But there's a long list of people that want to go up to this cabin, you know? Also, another fact that I learned in my years is that you don't have to own a condo in Hawaii. You have to have a friend with a condo in Hawaii. And that same friend has a friend that has a cabin out in the wilderness in Oregon. Works out beautifully. You know, you don't have to rent it. You go up. And now I took that guy up. And he is Mr. Negative. He does not believe anybody or anything. You know, he's always, if you ever heard of, well, you've heard of Winnie the Pooh, you know, there's characters in there, some of his make-believe characters. One of them is Eeyore the donkey, and he's always negative. Probably going to rain today, you know. And then the other one is Tigger, and I'm Tigger. The wonderful thing about Tiggers, you know, bouncing around, always looking positive. Conrad is always negative Nancy, man. He's always there. So we took him up there. And while he still says he doesn't believe, now that he's been at the site and sees how remote it is, and then hears all the noises, and then when his buddy says, did you hear that knock? What knock? I said, listen. Pretty soon. Yeah? I said, that's Bigfoot. No. I said, well, who's going to be out knocking on the tree at midnight? You know, no, people don't do that. And so he's not a believer yet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to stake him down out in the meadow out of the cabin. I'm going to cover him in butter, and we'll see what comes up to examine him in the middle of the night, you know. I hear they like s'mores because that's what attracted him to our fire, I think. But I'm not really. I think the fire attracted him because we're way out in the middle of nowhere, and that's probably something they didn't see much of. So fun times.
Before you had your initial experience, what did you think of Bigfoot? Was it even a thought on the back of your mind at all, or was it something you learned after?
I heard of it, you know, and I was of the opinion at the time, like I say, that when this happened, I was about 26, and I had known of Bigfoot sightings, and being a kid that grew up in the country, I understand animals and so forth. I didn't have a negative connotation about them, but I didn't know if they were real or not until I had my experience. And it only took me a few minutes. Actually, I realized what that was by the time I was back in the cabin, that we're dealing with something that's unknown to me. And that's when I started doing the research. I called my buddy, and it just confirmed it. So I wasn't one that said Bigfoots are just stories of crazy people, because I've been an avid reader all my life. And I've read a lot of historical stuff, and I like biographies, and I've read a lot of Native Americans, and I've heard of their legends of the people, you know, and I forget what they'd call them. Maybe Sasquatch is where their name came from, but they would talk of these mountain people, you know. And then I've also read of explorers that have had experiences. And so I've heard of it, but I did not know it was real. I thought maybe it was something from way back when, you know. And there's a lot of things that were there way back when that aren't here anymore. But this one now, once I had that experience, and so I've been, you know, I was 26 now, I'm 67 now. So we're 41 years down the road. Absolutely convinced. And every year I get even more convinced as I do research. And I'm open-minded. I will give a documentary a chance. I don't know if you ever saw the one called Discovering Bigfoot with Standing. There's a lot of controversy about that one. They're saying that he made up those animal faces, and he could have. I don't know for sure. But his presentation was good, and it was realistic. Now, one of the scientists that he had with him, when he went and interviewed him, I did notice that there was a lot of Bigfoot stuff all over the guy's thing. So I'm going, okay, this is just one of the guys that promotes Bigfoot. But the other guy wasn't. And so it was just, I watched it, and I think that's the most convincing document. However, there is some showmanship in it, with him running around in his ghillie suit and posing and doing this sort of stuff. So it was a bit of a production there instead of I think he was just trying to get business, and he does. He still does. Do I think he's a fake? No. I just think he's a guy that's had experiences and he's just trying to market them. He's just trying to make a buck, you know? And I find that most researchers, if they're not looking to make the buck, they're more authentic, you know? Hey, wonderful meeting you. Thank you. And have a good evening, man. Remember, just smile.
Oh, okay? Yes. Take care, Derek. Thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye.
Take care, man. See you later.
Make sure you go check out Derek's website, lifewithangie.com. He's got a bunch of blog posts and some audio versions as well of him telling his stories. It's a really, really wonderful website. You can find us, CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, and you can reach us directly, CryptidClues@gmail.com. Until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe.